Mike Evans stood on the sprawling deck of a lakeside villa perched on the shores of Lake Washington, just outside Seattle. The early evening air carried a crisp breeze, and the water shimmered under the fading sunlight, reflecting the kind of postcard beauty that made you pause. At 34, Mike, a marketing strategist with a knack for turning small brands into local legends, had poured every ounce of himself into this moment. Tonight was his wife Emily's 32nd birthday, and he'd spent months crafting a celebration that would remind her, and himself, that their 4-year marriage still held the spark it had when they first met. Emily had always dreamed of a grown-up party, something elegant and timeless, far removed from the paper plates and backyard barbecues of their 20s. No tacky themes or cheap beer, she'd said once, half laughing, her hazel eyes lighting up. I want candles, live music, and a view that makes you feel alive. Mike had taken her words to heart. He'd scoured venues for weeks before settling on this villa, a modern masterpiece of glass and stone, with oak-lined pathways and a wraparound deck that caught every breeze off the lake. It was the kind of place you'd see in a lifestyle magazine, the kind that screamed, "We made it." He'd gone all in. Hired an event planner to orchestrate the details, a string quartet to play soft, jazzy renditions of Emily's favorite songs, delicate fairy lights strung between the trees, long tables draped in ivory linens with handwritten calligraphy menus. The caterer, a Michelin-trained chef, had designed a menu around Emily's tastes: seared salmon with honey glaze, roasted asparagus, and a lavender creme brulee she'd once raved about after a trip to Napa. Mike had even tracked down a case of rare Chardonnay from a small vineyard she'd mentioned years ago, charmed by its minimalist label. "You notice everything," she'd said back then, kissing his cheek. That memory had driven him to make tonight flawless. Dressed in a tailored navy suit Emily had picked out during a shopping trip downtown, Mike moved through the villa's courtyard, checking details with the planner. The quartet was tuning their instruments, their notes floating over the hum of arriving staff. Waiters in crisp black vests arranged silver trays of appetizers. The planner, a brisk woman named Lauren, ticked off items on her tablet. "Sound levels are good, lighting's set, and the bar's fully stocked," she said. Mike nodded, his stomach tight with nerves. He'd never planned anything this elaborate. Birthdays in the past had been intimate, dinner at their favorite bistro, maybe a weekend hike in the Cascades. But this was a statement. A reminder to Emily that he still saw her, really saw her, even after the grind of work and life had started to dull their edges. He was adjusting a centerpiece, a cluster of white roses and eucalyptus, when Lauren's assistant, a young guy with a headset, approached, looking hesitant. "Mr. Evans? Sorry to interrupt, but the security lead asked me to pass something along." Mike turned, eyebrows raised. "Everything okay?" he asked. The assistant shifted his weight. "Yeah, it's just, one of the guards noticed Emily went into the main house earlier with someone from your party. They've been upstairs for a while, maybe 30 minutes. In one of the guest rooms." Mike's smile froze. "Upstairs? With who?" His voice was calm, but his pulse quickened. The assistant glanced at his clipboard, as if it held the answer. The guard said it was a tall guy, short hair, had a big tattoo on his neck. A dragon, I think." The words hit Mike like a slow-motion punch. He knew exactly who that was. Dylan Crow. Emily's old college friend, though friend had always felt like the wrong word. Dylan had moved back to Seattle 6 months ago, after years in San Francisco, and suddenly he was everywhere: brunches, game nights, Emily's art gallery openings. She'd always brushed off Mike's unease. "He's just outgoing, babe. You're overthinking it," she'd say, laughing. But Mike had seen the way Dylan lingered too close, his hand grazing her arm, his jokes a little too personal. Now, standing in the courtyard with the quartet's music swelling behind him, Mike felt a cold knot form in his chest. "Thanks for letting me know," he said, his tone neutral. The assistant nodded and hurried off. Mike's eyes drifted to the villa's upper floor, where tall windows glowed softly against the dusk. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe they were sorting out a surprise for the party, or Dylan needed help with something work-related. Emily was the host. She'd want everything perfect too, right? But the knot in his chest tightened, and his feet were already moving toward the house. The villa's interior was quiet, the marble floors echoing his steps. The staff were all outside, setting up, leaving the grand staircase empty. Mike climbed it slowly, his hand trailing the polished banister. At the top, a long hallway stretched toward the guest rooms. One door, at the far end, was closed. He stood there for a moment, listening. No voices, no movement. His heart pounded, not from anger, but from a creeping dread he couldn't name. He knocked once, the sound sharp in the silence. 10 seconds passed, then the door opened. Emily stood there, her dark hair slightly tousled, her smile bright but unsteady, like she'd been caught off guard. She wore the sapphire blue dress Mike had gifted her for their anniversary, the one she'd said made her feel unstoppable. In her hand was a charging cable, loosely coiled. "Oh, Mike, you're here already?" she said, her voice a pitch too high. Dylan needed help with his laptop, some work thing, a presentation. "The Wi-Fi up here's spotty." She laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mike nodded slowly, his gaze flicking past her into the room. It was empty. No Dylan, no laptop, just an unmade bed and a half-open window. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. "Yeah, totally," she said, stepping into the hallway and pulling the door shut behind her. "I'm just heading back down. Guests will be here soon, right?" She touched his arm, her fingers light, and moved past him toward the stairs. Mike didn't follow. He stood there, staring at the closed door, as the first notes of the quartet drifted up from the courtyard. Something inside him shifted, not a snap, but a quiet fracture, like a crack spreading through glass. He exhaled, unaware he'd been holding his breath, and forced himself to turn back toward the party. The night was just beginning, but already, it felt like it was slipping away. Mike stood at the edge of the villa's courtyard, the fairy lights casting a warm glow over the arriving guests. The string quartet's jazzy rendition of an old Norah Jones song filled the air, blending with the clink of wine glasses and the low hum of laughter. The Lake Washington villa was alive now, its stone walls and sprawling deck transformed into the elegant scene Mike had envisioned for Emily's 32nd birthday. But as he watched the crowd, his navy suit suddenly felt too tight, his tie a noose. The moment in the upstairs hallway clung to him like damp air. The closed door, Emily's nervous smile, the empty guest room where Dylan should have been. He scanned the courtyard, trying to shake the unease. Emily was already mingling, her sapphire dress catching the light as she moved from group to group. She had that gift, making everyone feel like they were the only person in the room. Guests leaned in when she spoke, laughing at her quick wit, their eyes bright with admiration. Mike had always loved that about her, how she could turn a stranger into a friend in minutes. But tonight, her radiance felt distant, like a star he could see but no longer touch. He forced himself to focus. The planner, Lauren, waved him over to check the seating chart. "Everything's on track," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "We'll serve appetizers in 10, then dinner at 8:30. Sound good?" Mike nodded, barely listening. His eyes drifted back to Emily, now laughing with a couple from her art gallery circle. Her hand rested lightly on the woman's arm, her head tilted back in that effortless way that made her look invincible. For a moment, he almost convinced himself he'd misread the upstairs moment. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was projecting his own insecurities onto a harmless interaction. Then he saw him. Dylan Crow slipped into the courtyard, late, his black shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his dragon tattoo peeking out like a warning. He moved with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere, shaking hands and flashing a grin that showed too many teeth. Mike's jaw tightened. Dylan hadn't been on the guest list, at least, not the one Mike had approved. But Emily had mentioned inviting a few extra friends last week, and Mike hadn't pressed. Now, watching Dylan weave through the crowd, he wished he had. Emily's face lit up when she spotted Dylan. She waved him over, her smile wider than it had been all night. Mike's stomach churned as Dylan leaned in, saying something that made her laugh, a sharp, genuine sound that Mike hadn't heard from her in months. He stood frozen, a glass of Chardonnay in his hand, as the scene unfolded like a movie he couldn't pause. Dylan's hand brushed Emily's shoulder, lingering just a second too long. She didn't pull away. Mike turned away, pretending to check his phone. He didn't want to be that guy, the paranoid husband who read betrayal into every glance. But the pieces were stacking up. Dylan's sudden reappearance in their lives 6 months ago, after years of radio silence. The way Emily's phone had started staying face down on the counter, its notifications silenced. The late nights at her gallery, where she'd come home with flushed cheeks and vague excuses about networking events. Mike had swallowed it all, telling himself it was just a phase, that marriage had its ebbs and flows. But now, with Dylan here, in the heart of the night Mike had built for her, Doubt clawed at him. He made his way to the bar, needing something stronger than wine. The bartender, a young woman with a quick smile, poured him a whiskey. "Looks like a hell of a party," she said, nodding toward the crowd. "You the mastermind?" Mike managed a half-smile. "Something like that." He took a sip, the burn grounding him. He needed to stay sharp, to keep the night on track. This was still Emily's birthday, still their life together. He wouldn't let a gut feeling derail it. But the feeling wouldn't leave. As he returned to the courtyard, he caught snippets of conversations, friends praising the venue, colleagues gushing over the food. "Emily's so lucky," one woman said, clutching a cocktail. "This is straight out of a dream." Mike nodded politely, but the words felt hollow. Lucky. Was she? Was he? He thought of the upstairs room again, the charging cable in Emily's hand, her rushed explanation about Dylan's work presentation. Why a guest room? Why a closed door? His mind spun, stitching together moments he'd ignored, like the time he'd come home early and found Dylan in their kitchen, eating leftovers straight from the fridge while Emily laughed at his story. Mike had felt like an intruder in his own home that day, but he'd brushed it off. Now, the memory stung. Dinner was announced, and guests began settling at the long tables. Mike took his place at the head table, Emily to his right. She slid into her seat, her perfume, a mix of jasmine and citrus, filling the space between them. "This is incredible, Mike," she said, her voice warm but hurried, like she was checking a box. She touched his knee lightly, then turned to chat with a friend across the table. Mike watched her, searching for the woman he'd married, the one who'd once left him handwritten notes on the fridge, who'd danced with him in their living room to no music at all. She was still there, wasn't she? The first course arrived, crab cakes with a lemon aioli, and the crowd's energy lifted. Mike picked at his plate, his appetite gone. Across the table, Dylan sat with a group of Emily's gallery friends, his loud laugh cutting through the quartet's music. Mike's eyes flicked to Emily. She was listening to a story, her fork poised midair, but her gaze darted to Dylan for a split second. It was subtle, but Mike caught it. His grip tightened on his glass. Then it happened. As the servers cleared the plates, Emily stood, tapping her wine glass with a spoon. The crowd hushed, all eyes on her. She took the microphone from the quartet's singer, her smile radiant under the fairy lights. "I promise I won't sing," she said, earning a ripple of laughter. Mike shifted in his seat, expecting her to thank him, to acknowledge the months he'd spent making this night perfect. Instead, she raised her glass and said, "I want to thank someone who's been my rock, my inspiration. Dylan, you've pushed me to be fearless, to chase my dreams. Thank you for being you." The courtyard erupted in applause. Dylan nodded, cool and composed, like he'd been waiting for this. Mike sat motionless, his pulse roaring in his ears. The whiskey in his stomach turned to acid. Emily turned to him then, still smiling, and placed a small white box in front of him. "For you, Mike," she said softly. "A symbol of where we're going." The guests cooed, thinking it was sweet. Mike's hands moved mechanically, opening the box. Inside was her wedding ring, the one he'd slipped onto her finger 4 years ago, under a canopy of stars. His breath caught. The courtyard spun. The courtyard of the Lake Washington villa pulsed with life, the fairy lights swaying gently in the evening breeze. The string quartet shifted to a slower, soulful melody, and the clatter of dessert plates mingled with bursts of laughter. Emily's 32nd birthday party was a glittering success, every detail Mike had agonized over, down to the lavender creme brulee and the handwritten menus, executed flawlessly. But as Mike sat at the head table, the small white box containing Emily's wedding ring burned a hole in his reality. Her toast to Dylan still echoed in his ears, the applause from the guests a cruel soundtrack to the moment his world tilted. She'd called it a symbol, but to Mike, it was a severance. Emily was back in her element, leaning toward a friend to share a story, her sapphire dress catching the light with every gesture. Her laugh rang out, bright and effortless, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't just rewritten their marriage. Mike stared at the box, its contents heavier than the gold it held. The ring wasn't a replica or a sentimental trinket. It was her ring, the one he'd saved for months to buy, the one she'd cried over when he proposed on a rainy hike in the Cascades. Now it sat discarded, a prop in a performance he hadn't been invited to star in. He closed the box with a soft click and set it beside her half-empty wine glass. The guests around him chatted on, oblivious, their voices a dull roar. Some caught his eye, offering smiles or raised glasses, assuming he was basking in the night's triumph. "Amazing party," Mike called a colleague from across the table. He nodded, his face a mask of composure. Inside, a storm churned, not rage, not yet, but a cold, creeping certainty that something fundamental had broken. Emily reached for his hand under the table, her fingers grazing his knuckles. "You okay, babe?" she asked, her voice light, her eyes barely meeting his before darting back to the crowd. "Babe." The word grated, hollow now, a placeholder she used when she didn't want to say his name. "Yeah," Mike said, forcing a smile that felt like lifting weights. Just taking it all in. She squeezed his hand once, then let go, already turning to answer a friend's question about the dessert. Mike watched her, searching for a crack in her performance, a hint of guilt or hesitation. There was none. She was radiant, untouchable, the star of a night he'd built to honor her. Across the table, Dylan Crow lounged in his seat, one arm slung over the back of his chair, his dragon tattoo stark against his tan skin. He was telling a story, his loud laugh pulling in everyone around him. Mike's gaze lingered. Dylan had always been like this, larger than life, the kind of guy who filled a room without trying. In college, he'd been the one throwing parties, charming everyone, while Mike was the quiet one who showed up with a six-pack and left early. Emily had stories about Dylan from back then, late-night study sessions and road trips, but she'd always framed them as nostalgic, not romantic. "He's like a brother," she'd said once. Mike had believed her. Now, watching Dylan's easy grin and the way Emily's eyes flicked toward him, that belief felt like a bad bet. The servers began pouring coffee, signaling the night's shift toward toast and dancing. Mike's mind raced, piecing together moments he'd dismissed. The way Emily had started staying late at her gallery, blaming client meetings that stretched past midnight. The way her phone, once an extension of her hand, now lived face down or in her bag, its screen dark. The night 3 weeks ago, when he'd canceled a work call to surprise her at an exhibit she'd sworn was too artsy for him. He'd waited outside the gallery for an hour, the Seattle drizzle soaking his jacket. She never showed. When she got home, her hair wind-tossed and her cheeks pink, she'd kissed his forehead and said, "The show ran late. Total chaos." Mike hadn't mentioned the gallery's posted hours or the Instagram story from her friend Claire, showing a different event across town. He let it go, afraid of what pushing might uncover. Now, those moments weren't just doubts, they were evidence. He thought of the upstairs guest room, Emily's rushed explanation about Dylan's work presentation, the absence of a laptop, the closed door. His chest tightened, not with jealousy but with the sickening realization that he'd been explaining away the truth for months. Emily wasn't just distant, she was gone, slipping through his fingers while he clung to the version of her he'd fallen in love with. The quartet paused, and a guest stood to offer a toast, gushing about Emily's talent as an artist and her infectious energy. The crowd clapped, and Emily beamed, raising her glass. Mike joined in, his hands moving on autopilot. He caught Dylan's eye for a split second. Dylan nodded, a smirk tugging at his lips, like they were sharing a private joke. Mike looked away, his pulse hammering. He needed air, space, anything to stop the spiral in his head. But he stayed, rooted by the weight of the night he'd created, the guest who expected him to play the proud husband. Then Emily stood again, taking the microphone. The crowd hushed, eager for more of her charm. Mike's stomach dropped. He braced himself, hoping for a course correction, a nod to their marriage, to him. Instead, she smiled at the crowd and said, "I just want to add one thing. Dylan, you've been my rock this year. You've reminded me who I am, pushed me to dream bigger. I wouldn't be here without you." The applause was deafening, whistles and cheers filling the courtyard. Dylan raised his glass, cool as ever, while Emily's eyes sparkled with something Mike hadn't seen in ages, adoration. She turned to Mike then, her smile unchanged, and slid the white box closer to him. "Mike, this is for you," she said, her voice soft but public, like a scripted line. "A symbol of our next chapter." The guests cooed, some whispering about how cute it was. Mike's hand shook as he opened the box again, as if the ring might have vanished. It hadn't. Its gold band glinted under the lights, a quiet accusation. He looked at Emily, waiting for her to falter, to show she understood the weight of what she'd done. But she was already laughing at a friend's comment, her attention elsewhere. The courtyard blurred. Mike's ears rang, drowning out the music and chatter. He stood, his chair scraping softly against the stone floor. "Excuse me," he said to no one in particular, his voice steady despite the inferno in his chest. He walked away, past the glowing oaks, past the servers with their silver trays, past the life he'd built for her. The applause followed him, a hollow echo, as he stepped into the darkness beyond the villa's lights. He didn't look back. Mike drove through the sodium-lit streets of Seattle's outskirts, the villa's glow fading in his rearview mirror. The night was a blur, Lake Washington's shimmering water, the fairy lights, Emily's sapphire dress, the gold ring in the white box, all of it felt like a dream he'd been jolted awake from. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his jacket pocket, but he didn't check it. He couldn't. The weight of Emily's toast to Dylan, her wedding ring handed to him like a discarded keepsake, pressed against his chest, heavier than grief. It wasn't just betrayal, it was the realization that he'd been a bystander in his own marriage. He ended up at a budget motel off I-5, the kind with flickering neon signs and a vending machine humming in the lobby. The clerk, a tired man in his 50s, barely looked up as Mike paid for a week in cash. Room 204 was sparse, beige carpet, a sagging mattress, blinds that let in slivers of parking lot light. It smelled of stale coffee and cleaning spray. Mike dropped his suit jacket over a chair, loosened his tie, and sat on the bed's edge, staring at the wall. He didn't cry or shout. He just sat, hollow, as if his body was waiting for his mind to catch up. His phone buzzed again. He pulled it out, the screen a cascade of notifications. Emily. Her first messages were frantic. Asterisk, Mike, where are you? Please come back. Asterisk, then defensive. Asterisk, that wasn't what you think. You're blowing this out of proportion. Asterisk, by the third, she was angry. Asterisk, you just walked out? Really? After everything I've done for us? Asterisk, he read the words, but they didn't land. They were noise, not answers. He powered off the phone and tossed it onto the nightstand. The silence that followed was louder than the party's applause. The next morning, Mike woke to gray light seeping through the blinds. His suit was creased, his mouth dry. He turned his phone back on, half expecting an apology. Instead, more messages from Emily, now a mix of blame and self-pity. Asterisk, you've been so distant, Mike. I felt alone. You never listened. Asterisk, he stopped reading after the fifth. Each word was a deflection, a rewrite of their story where he was the villain. He thought of the ring, her smile as she handed it over, the way Dylan's name had rolled off her tongue during the toast. Alone? She hadn't been alone. She'd been with Dylan, in guest rooms and late-night meetings, while Mike planned her perfect night. He needed a plan, not emotions. That afternoon, he called a divorce attorney a colleague had recommended months ago, just in case. Mike had saved the number but never thought he'd use it. The attorney, a calm woman named Rachel, met him in a nondescript office near Pike Place. She listened as Mike recounted the basics, not the full story, just enough. The ring, the toast, the years of growing distance. What do you want? She asked, her pen poised over a notepad. Mike exhaled. No drama. No fights. Just a clean break. Rachel nodded. We can do that. I'll draft the papers and send them to her. Anything else? Mike hesitated, then added, tell her not to contact me directly. Everything goes through you. By evening, Rachel had sent Emily a formal letter outlining the divorce process, a timeline, and Mike's request for no direct communication. Mike added one line to the email himself. Asterisk, please respect my space and work through my attorney. Asterisk, it was cold, final, and necessary. Emily didn't respond, not to him, not to Rachel. The silence was both a relief and a wound. Mike stayed in the motel, the days blurring into a routine of takeout coffee and long walks along the waterfront. He avoided their shared apartment, their friends, their life. Mutual acquaintances texted, confused. Asterisk, hey, you okay? Heard you left the party. Asterisk, he didn't reply. Work was a lifeline. He took on freelance projects, burying himself in spreadsheets and ad campaigns. But at night, alone in the motel, his mind unraveled the past. The signs had been there, hadn't they? Emily's sudden girls' nights with friends he barely knew. Her phone, always on silent, left in her car or purse. The way she'd stopped leaving notes on the fridge, a habit she'd kept since their dating days. Once, he'd found a post-it in her handwriting, asterisk, you're my home, asterisk, and taped it to his laptop. Now, he wondered if she'd ever meant it. He thought of the gallery incident, a month before the party. He'd shown up to surprise her, standing in the Seattle rain outside a brick building downtown. She wasn't there. Later, she'd breezed in, claiming the event ran over. Mike hadn't mentioned the friend's Instagram story from a bar across town, or how her coat smelled faintly of someone else's cologne. He'd wanted to trust her, to believe their marriage was just in a rough patch. Now, those moments weren't just oversights. They were lies, stacking up like bricks in a wall between them. A week after the party, Mike met Rachel again. She hasn't contested the filing, Rachel said, sliding a folder across her desk. We can move forward with asset division and a settlement. Any changes to your terms? Mike shook his head. Just keep it simple. He didn't want the apartment, the car, or the savings they'd built. He wanted out. Rachel studied him. You're handling this well, she said, not unkindly. Mike shrugged. Doesn't feel like it. He left her office and walked to a nearby cafe, the same one he'd frequented before the motel became his temporary home. The barista, a college kid named Sam, knew his order. Black coffee, no sugar. Rough week? Sam asked, sliding the cup over. Mike gave a tight smile. Something like that. Sitting by the window, Mike watched the city move, tourists snapping photos, locals dodging raindrops. He felt like a ghost, untethered from the life he'd known. Emily's messages had stopped after the attorney's letter, but her absence was louder than her words had ever been. He wondered if she was with Dylan now, if the party had been her way of rewriting their story in front of everyone. The thought didn't spark anger anymore, just a dull ache, like pressing a bruise. Then, one evening, a text came from Claire, a mutual friend who'd always been more Mike's ally than Emily's. Asterisk, can we talk? Not about her, just stuff. Asterisk, Mike hesitated, then agreed to meet at a quiet bar near Fremont. Claire was already there, nursing a gin and tonic, her expression wary. I'm not here to defend her, she said as Mike Saturday, but you deserve to know what's going on. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Emily's been a mess since you left. She's telling everyone you overreacted, that the ring was symbolic. But Dylan? He's not what she thinks. I heard he's been seeing someone else, a co-worker, behind her back. Mike sipped his beer, the information settling like ash. Does she know? He asked. Claire shook her head. Not yet, but it's going to hit her hard. Mike nodded, staring at the table. He didn't feel vindicated, just tired. Claire reached for his hand. You didn't deserve this, Mike. None of it. He pulled away gently. Thanks, he said, and left soon after. The news about Dylan should have felt like justice, but it didn't. It just made the whole thing sadder. Back at the motel, Mike lay on the bed. The ceiling's water stains his only company. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, husband, fool, or something else entirely. But one thing was clear, he couldn't go back. Not to Emily, not to the life he'd built around her. The ring, the toast, the lies, they'd stripped away the illusion. Now, he had to figure out what was left. Mike stood on the Seattle waterfront, the Puget Sound stretching gray and endless before him. The early spring air was sharp, carrying the salt of the sea and the faint hum of the city waking up. At 34, he felt older than his years, but lighter too, as if the weight of Emily's betrayal had finally begun to lift. 3 months had passed since the night at the Lake Washington villa, since the ring in the white box and the toast that shattered his marriage. The motel room, the attorney's letters, the silence, they were behind him now. Today, he held a camera, its lens pointed at the horizon, capturing the way the dawn broke over the water. For the first time in months, he felt like he was seeing clearly. The divorce was nearly finalized. Rachel, his attorney, had kept things clean, just as Mike wanted. Emily hadn't fought the terms, though her initial silence had given way to a flood of attempts to reach him. Emails, voicemails, even a handwritten letter slipped under his motel door. Asterisk, I messed up, Mike. I was lost. Please, let's talk. Asterisk, her words were desperate, but they rang hollow. They weren't apologies for the ring, for Dylan, for the public humiliation. They were apologies for getting caught, for the life she'd thought she could trade up for crumbling. Mike deleted the emails, ignored the calls, and threw the letter away unopened. He'd given her 4 years of his heart. He wouldn't give her his future too. Life at the motel had become a strange cocoon. The beige walls and flickering lights forced Mike to face himself, stripped of the roles he'd clung to. Husband, provider, the guy who made Emily's dreams come true. In the quiet, he started to rebuild. He signed up for a photography course at a community center, rekindling a passion he'd abandoned in his 20s to chase a stable career. The camera gave him focus, a way to see the world without the filter of Emily's expectations. He shot the city's edges, rusted piers, rain-slicked streets, the faces of strangers at Pike Place. Each click felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. Work became another anchor. Mike threw himself into his marketing freelance gigs, pitching bold campaigns that landed him a contract with a local tech startup. The team was young, hungry, and didn't care about his personal life, just his results. Late nights at their Belltown office, brainstorming over pizza and whiteboards, reminded him he was good at something, that he wasn't defined by Emily's choices. He rented a small studio apartment near the waterfront, trading the motel's stale air for a view of the Sound. It wasn't much, bare walls, a second-hand couch, but it was his. The news about Dylan came unexpectedly, like a footnote to a story Mike was done reading. He was at his usual cafe, a cozy spot in Capitol Hill where the barista, Sam, greeted him with a nod and a black coffee, right? Mike was editing photos on his laptop when Claire, their mutual friend, slid into the seat across from him. "I'm not here to stir drama," she said, her voice low. "But you should know what happened." She told him Dylan had imploded. A coworker at his firm had filed an HR complaint, exposing his affairs, including one with another employee, overlapping with his time with Emily. The company fired him for violating their ethics policy, and Dylan skipped town, leaving behind a trail of deleted social media and unanswered calls. Emily found out at a gallery event, Claire said. Someone mentioned it, thinking she knew. She left in tears. Mike stirred his coffee, the steam curling between them. "Is she okay?" he asked, more out of reflex than concern. Claire shrugged. "She's unraveling. Keep saying she made a mistake, that she misses you. But it's too late, right?" Mike nodded, his gaze fixed on his laptop screen. He didn't feel triumph or pity, just distance. Emily's world had collapsed under the weight of her own choices, and he wasn't her safety net anymore. Her attempts to reach him intensified after that. Emails turned into voice messages, her voice cracking as she begged for a conversation. Asterisk, "I was stupid, Mike. I didn't see what I had." Asterisk, a bouquet of roses arrived at his new apartment, the card in her neat handwriting. Asterisk, "Can we start over?" Asterisk, Mike left the flowers in the lobby for someone else to take. When a postcard showed up, a photo of the Olympic Peninsula, where they'd once camped, she'd written, Asterisk, "You were my anchor. I'm so sorry." Asterisk, he tossed it in the recycling bin. Her apologies weren't for him. They were for the void Dylan left, for the spotlight that had dimmed when her audience moved on. Mike's photography instructor, a gruff woman named Lena, noticed his work improving. "You're not just shooting scenes," she said one evening, reviewing his portfolio. "You're telling stories." That's rare. Her words stuck with him. He started a small Instagram account, posting his photos, anonymous shots of Seattle's underbelly, its beauty in the overlooked. The account gained traction, first dozens of followers, then hundreds. A local gallery reached out, offering to feature his work in a group show. Mike hesitated, then agreed. It wasn't about fame. It was about proving to himself he could create something new. The divorce papers arrived a week before the gallery show. Mike signed them in Rachel's office, the pen steady in his hand. "You're officially free," Rachel said, a faint smile on her face. Mike didn't feel free, not exactly, but he felt unburdened, like he'd shed a skin that no longer fit. He walked out into the Seattle drizzle, the city's pulse syncing with his own. That night, he stood in the gallery, his photos framed on the walls alongside other artists. Friends from his startup showed up, clapping him on the shoulder. Claire was there too, raising a glass. "To new beginnings," she said. Mike clinked her glass, a real smile breaking through. Emily didn't come, but her shadow lingered. Claire mentioned she'd moved to Portland, chasing a fresh start. "She's still talking about you," Claire said quietly. "Says she didn't realize what she lost." Mike nodded, sipping his wine. He didn't wish her ill, but he didn't wish her well either. She was a chapter closed, a lesson learned. Love wasn't enough if it wasn't mutual. He'd poured himself into her, but she'd seen him as a backdrop, not a partner. Now, he was writing his own story. The waterfront became his ritual. Each morning, Mike walked the pier, camera in hand, capturing the way the light danced on the waves. He wasn't the man who'd planned the villa party, nor the one who'd sat hollow in a motel room. He was something new and perfect, but whole. As the sun rose over the Sound, he snapped a final shot, a goal soaring against the dawn, free and untethered. He lowered the camera and smiled. For the first time in years, he felt like he was enough.